Dinosaurs were scary as hell, everyone knows that. But while they were the best known prehistoric monsters, there were plenty of other equally scary things that came both before and after. We've already covered the prehistoric predators that nearly wiped out the dinosaurs, so today we're covering the prehistoric monsters that came after them. For this one specifically in Africa. In this video we're looking at the history of the fauna of Africa from the asteroid impact onwards. And we'll look at Africa's long solo career, its multiple iterations of big scary monsters, and how they all resulted in the most dangerous animal of today. And we'll finish up with a look at how our ancestors and their kin evolved in the face of all these beasts, and a question about why they're no longer with us. Let's start from the beginning. After the breakup of Pangaea, towards the end of the Cretaceous, India was rocketing off towards Eurasia. South America had begun its long and gentle rafting towards the Bahamas, and Africa had detached from Australia and Antarctica and was beginning its life as the largest landmass for the first time. Being mostly tropical wasn't as special then as it is now, as the climate was about the same as it had been before the asteroid impact, and even the poles were pretty temperate. China, the Americas, the Mediterranean, and even much of Siberia joined Africa in a period of lovely tropical weather. Even the bottom of the ocean was positively balmy at up to 12 degrees Celsius, which is a lot more manageable than the just above freezing that we get down there nowadays. Within a decade after the asteroid impact, most of the dust had cleared, and within a single human lifetime pretty much everything was back to normal. Only that most animals were now dead. More than 75% of all species vanished in almost an instant. But the survivors would emerge with their own strategies for terrifying violence, and they'd start all of this in the Paleogene period. With the asteroid impact, the Cretaceous gave way to the first epoch of the Paleogene, the Paleocene. This is a tricky period for African fossil records, as the continent was covered in even thicker and larger forests than it is today. And forests have two things going for them that hinder fossilization. First, they have acidic soils that corrode hard organic matter like bone. And secondly, they are exceptionally rich in wildlife, including detritivores and scavengers, and all those pesky little critters that won't let a corpse rest in peace. Add to this the lack of infrastructure and stability across most of the continent, and it's a recipe for disappointment in the world of paleontology. Still, some records have been kept, and we can also extrapolate from a lot of what was going on in the rest of the world. So anyway, dinosaurs were out. Well, almost. Being small and highly mobile, avian dinosaurs, or birds as they like to be called nowadays, took some hits but ultimately slipped through the net to repopulate the skies. The rest of dinosaur kind weren't so lucky, and neither was almost every terrestrial vertebrate over 25 kilograms. The exception to this generalization were the cold-blooded killers that could just sit in the mud and wait. And there's no group of animals who have done better at this and for longer than the crocodilians. Our first entry on the list of reasons why post-Cretaceous Africa was still too hot to handle is Hyposaurus. Not the largest croc you'll ever see, but remember that almost everything else above 25 kg was now dead. So this predator, along with many of its friends all over the world, quickly rose to dominate what was left. Unlike crocs around today, Paleocene crocs still held on to the very adaptation that made them so frightening before the dinosaurs took over. They could run. In fact, it's thought that Hyposaurus would have been able to gallop, but this was still a semi-aquatic species living in shallow, nearshore marine environments. That's actually likely the reason we know of its existence at all, since that's where most fossils from this period show up. There were far more terrestrial rampaging apex crocs popping up elsewhere, such as the 3-meter South American Sabicus, which started to evolve into very tyrannosaur-like morphologies, particularly in the tooth area. So there's no reason to assume that this pattern of global takeover wasn't also being explored in our home continent. But while crocs were basically doing what they'd always done, some of the earliest horrors of mammalian imagination were quickly rising to compete. Hyaenodonts probably originated as far back as the Cretaceous, but back then they filled the roles of the much smaller mustelids that we find around us today, scurrying about, partially arboreal, being ferocious but generally keeping out of the way of the heavyweights. But of course, after the heavyweight division was cleared by the big space rock, there was no such concern, and Hyaenodonts expanded across the globe, keeping up with and in turn putting selective pressure on the increasing size of their mammalian prey. Right from the start, this group of carnivores had jaws you wouldn't want to be anywhere near, self-sharpening teeth designed for cutting through meat. Early hyaenodonts, such as those found in Africa during the Paleogene, would have been smaller and more explosive animals that would gradually increase in size and running ability as the millennia progressed, and their prey evolved better ways to avoid them. In the wake of their reptilian overlords, these were suddenly the dominant predators on land in almost every niche that the crocodiles hadn't taken. But they hadn't peaked yet, so we'll come back to them. It is early in this period that another group of arboreal mammals becomes quite common. The order known as Plesioadaptiforms contains the earliest examples of fingernails in place of claws. With so much danger on the ground, it's likely they remained in the trees for quite some time, but some say they could have adapted to glide between the branches, as we see in a handful of other arboreal mammal species, like colugos. Interestingly, the earliest fossils of this group come from North America, but by the late Paleocene, somehow they were in Africa too. They weren't scary yet either, though, so we'll come back to them too. One of the reasons hyaenodonts would get bigger was that the herbivores of the time were doing the same thing. By the latter epoch of the Paleogene, the Oligocene, Gomphotheres had arrived. These were the precursors to modern elephants, including those around today, plus their super-dead relatives like the mammoths and the Paleoloxodon. Gomphotheres began with species like Gomphotherium, whose characteristic lower jaw tusks were a bold experiment that would not end up being repeated by their modern successors. These were about the size of an Asian elephant, but they were really weird. Alongside similar genre like Tetralophodon and the later Rhynchotherium from the Americas, you can't help but wonder if our artistic renderings of these ancient beasts are embarrassingly inaccurate. These were huge herbivores, and probably with the same attitude that African elephants have had for as long as we've known them, so these would have been extremely dangerous animals to get in the way of. Despite the patchy fossil record, some giant flightless bird finds have shown that the African Oligocene was also home to terrestrial feathered monsters, and modern snakes were starting to show up, with boids and pythons getting worryingly large. Just take a look at Gigantophis, for example, who would have reached up to 11 meters long and swam about in what is now the Sahara 40 million years ago. The foundation for many of the most toxic snakes in Africa today were there as well. Basal colubroids were found in Africa from around this time, suggesting that this might be where they all diverged into colubrids and elapids, two of the most dangerous branches of snakes on the planet. Indeed, the very fact that they were found at all gives us clues as to what was going on in the region, and suggests a transition from the wetter forest habitats of the boids to the drier, more grassy plains of the colubrids, who would likely have exploded in this new landscape as the Neogene arrived. With the expansion of these grasslands, those fingernailed arboreal little things we mentioned before were put under a lot of pressure. Having been around for about 40 million years by this point, they had come a long way already, and while this order would ultimately go extinct by the beginning of the Neogene, their offshoots would succeed them. Two important lineages, in particular stemming from the Plesioadaptiforms, were present: the mostly arboreal monkeys and the more terrestrial, heavier apes. The Neogene brought with it a general cooling and much drier conditions. It's also the moment Africa crashed into Eurasia, which may have significantly contributed to some of these climatic changes. Around this same time, the ape branch produced the earliest members of our very own family, Hominidae. What it most certainly did is create a land bridge between the two continents, allowing descendants from those weird elephants, the Gomphotheres, to expand across the world. Some remained, like the ridiculous 4-meter Dinotherium, but a lot of species came in too. Large ruminants like the rhinoceros started to shift into Africa, and hyaenodonts reached their intimidating crescendo, with examples like Simbacubwa and Megistotherium possibly surpassing a ton in pure hypercarnivorous mass. But this was perhaps the most monstrous period for the continent since the dinosaurs abandoned it. The influx of a new order of predators, carnivorans, saw Africa's Miocene landscapes become the battleground for a terrifying spate of predatory competition between the native Hyaenodonts and the invading carnivorans. And with the latter came some of the scariest mammals to have ever done it. Dinocricuta is the largest hyena species ever found, living or dead, standing around a meter tall and weighing over 200 kilograms. It had bone-crushing jaws, and snapping at the heels of giraffes and rhinos, it chased them into Africa from Europe, where the jaws of Hyaenodonts would be waiting. And it came with backup. Some of the most powerful carnivorans ever to live were peaking around this time. The so-called bear dogs, or amphicyonids, were trendsetters in this regard, with the largest species likely growing up to a ton in mass, and bigger than a polar bear. And big cats weren't far behind them either. They would show up in Africa a little later, probably towards the end of the Pleistocene epoch, but they'd shake things up tremendously, and despite this terrifying influx of killers, our own ancestors were exploding onto the scene. In fact, by the time the Neogene was coming to a close, there had been 10 genera of hominidae that we know of, and likely more. And by the time the Pliocene rolled over into the Pleistocene, Australopithecus, our ancestor, was an expert in dealing with some of these monsters. Researchers are still trying to tease apart the taxonomy of these ancient hominids, but by the first epoch of the Quaternary, the Pleistocene, our genus Homo was pretty likely around. Unfortunately for them, so was Locotungulurus. We're about to finish up with the final showdown between the most dangerous of all African monsters, but before we do, we'd just like to say thanks for watching and remind you that you can support us tremendously simply by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. We'd love to have you on board. So, by the Pleistocene, Africa was looking a lot more like it does today. The Hyaenodonts were long gone, likely as a result of all the updated carnivoran models flooding into the continent. Leopards were evolving in Africa, rhinos were already well established, hippos were well on their way, and elephants had already been there for ages, including a bunch of now extinct elephants like the mammoths. But there were still some creepy old monsters too. We just mentioned Locotungulurus, and this was one of many of the scimitar-toothed cats. Much like saber-toothed cats in Europe and the Americas, these were piercing felines, and they'd been around since the late Pliocene at least, growing upwards of 500 kilograms, and generally terrorizing anything meaty. Between leopards, mammoths, and these guys, the plains of Africa were a death trap for our ancestors, who had to balance hunting for meat against being hunted for it. And as if it couldn't get any more frightening, there are now fossil finds of teeth from leopard seals from Pleistocene freshwater sediment from South Africa. So these 400-kilogram hunters would have also made it very difficult to cross rivers. It's almost no wonder our species left the continent, until of course you consider that it wasn't really much safer anywhere else. So in order to survive in such a violent world of terrors, our ancestors had to become monsters themselves. As it is, of all the members of our genus, Homo sapiens remains the only one. And a lot of this is likely down to our sort of organized aggression. Being relatively slow and squishy, we certainly couldn't fight off these monsters alone, so the social skills and intelligence of our ancestors allowed them to overcome their physical limitations. Unfortunately, we didn't all make it. It's beginning to look as though the early members of our species were sired from a bunch of hybridization events between different Homo species. It might be a form of hybrid vigor, then, that allowed us to thrive while all other species declined. And there's no doubt that our evolved aggression would have been turned on each other in many cases, as it is still today. So that probably played a role in the loss of all other human species too. Whatever happened, Homo sapiens began a rampage around the planet during the Pleistocene that saw a rapid decline in African megafauna sizes by around 50% by 100,000 years ago. And then that trend continued as our species moved out to colonize other landmasses. Skills that allowed our ancestors to survive in this brutal prehistoric ecosystem would ultimately turn against us. In a pattern very similar to the Cretaceous asteroid effect, terrestrial animals over a certain size quickly disappeared. From almost the birth of our species, this phenomenon known as size-biased extinction appears to just be something we do. So it's hard to argue with the idea that the most frightening animal to have come out of prehistoric Africa since the dinosaurs is us. And on that note, that's all for this video. Feel free to have a look at some of our others and subscribe to catch the next one, which may or may not have something to do with prehistoric humans riding dinosaurs into battle. Thanks again for watching, and see you next time.